Good morning, class. We're going to be talking about environmental interactions this week. Last week we covered the introduction to this lesson by talking by reviewing the concepts of producers, and then we have consumers, and we have decomposers. So now we're going to go a little more in depth with how organisms and the roles they play interact with the environment and other organisms in the environment. So we're gonna move on to our first slide. So, what are interactions? So, an interaction could be one of many different kinds of interactions, and it depends on the role that the organism plays on the environment. So, we have producers. They produce energy by taking energy from the sun, going through photosynthesis, and producing complex sugars. So they so plants are kind of interesting because they do something called indirect competition. So they compete with other plants for resources such as sunlight and water, and they do that by growing at different rates, and they try to outgrow other plants so that they get more sunlight, and the less fit plant does not get as much sunlight as they get the shade from the taller plant. So that's an example of competition in terms of plants. And then you have grass eating animals. You can kind of think about their role. They eat plants, so they eat plants and grasses, stuff like that, and they outcompete each other by eating the plant debris before other animals can get to it. So this can either be from animals of the same species or animals of a different species. So and then you have meat eating animals. They eat the herbivores. So it's very similar interaction. And with this interaction, you get animals are competing for the ability to hunt down an animal and eat that animal, or to eat the scraps that are left behind from the animal that did the hunting. You usually see this for like animals like lions. They'll hunt down a gazelle. They'll eat their fill and they'll leave the rest. And then after that, you have hyenas and stuff like that, and they're going to compete with each other to to get the scraps. Or you have buzzards. They do the same thing. So that's a good way to think about how competition works between species. And so we're just going to go more in depth with the next slide. So I already mentioned it, competition. They're fighting for resources. Better fitness means that they have a higher likelihood of getting that limited resource. So as I mentioned earlier, earlier I mentioned it with the rabbits and competing for like grass and stuff like that. So here we're going to be talking about gray squirrels. So you see the gray squirrel has an acorn, the other one does not. So that is the limited food resource, and the other squirrel without the resource is the one that got outcompeted. So the one that got outcompeted, he was either unlucky or he wasn't as fit as the other squirrel to get the resource. And typically, organisms with better fitness, they survive longer and they have more opportunities to reproduce. And those traits that are considered more fit in an environment are what are inherited by organisms, by future generations of that organism. All right, so predation, mentioned it briefly with lions. So here we have a fox and a rabbit. So it's the interaction that occurs when an organism consumes another organism for energy. So here we have the example is a wolf, or the image is fox. So same concept. So the fox is hunting the rabbit for food. So the fox in this example is the meat eating consumer, and the rabbit is a plant eating consumer. And say that there were two foxes. Both foxes would be competing for the same rabbit because they're fighting for the rabbit, which is the limited food resource, and that's where they get their energy. So this is an example for predation, and I just gave with the two foxes. I gave you another example for competition. All right, so now we're going to talk about symbiosis. So symbiosis is really interesting because it's when two organisms have this interaction, and one or both organisms can benefit from the interaction. So it doesn't necessarily have to be both. This relationship can be broken down into three categories. We have mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. We're gonna start with commensalism. So there's an interaction between two organisms in which one organism benefits and the other organism is not benefited, nor is that other organism harmed. So you see, this grass-eating herbivore. When he eats the grass and the plants and stuff like that, he causes insects to fly around, and the birds on the back of this organism eat the bugs that are released when this organism eats the grass. So that's the best way to think about it. So the grass eating organism is not harmed. The ox is not harmed. He's indifferent about the birds. They are there, and the birds are there because they get a benefit by being on the ox's back. They get food. So this is a commensalistic interaction because the birds get a benefit, the ox does not. He's indifferent of the situation. All right. So now we have mutualism. So this is when two organisms two organisms benefit from the interaction. So the best way I can explain this one is a bee and flowers, because the bee is going to extract the nectar from the flower, which it uses to make honey, and with the bee landing on the flower, the stamen the stamen with the pollen rubs off on the little fur on the bee, and from here the bee will go to the next flower and fertilize that flower with that pollen, and then that flower will leave the pollen on here on the bee, and he will take it to yet another flower, and from here you get genetic diversity in the plant population. This is very beneficial. So the flowers make themselves inviting to the bees by producing lots of nectar, and then they produce longer stamens so that the bee has to dig into the flower, and they're more readily exposed to the pollen, which makes it easier for them to pass it along to the other plants. They both get a benefit. The bee gets the honey, they get their food resource, and the plant gets their genetic diversity by passing their genes along to other flowers. And now we're going to move on to one of the more, you can say, annoying interactions, because this is one that we're all very familiar with, especially during the summer when it's mosquito season. We have parasitism, where one organism is benefited, but the other organism is harmed. And the, the most relatable the most relatable organism that I could think of is the mosquito, because they will insert their proboscis. They will inject a little bit of saliva to prevent blood clotting, and from here they start consuming the blood of the organism that they are parasitizing. In this case, it is a human. So they use this to get their food resources, in which female mosquitoes will consume the nutrients from the blood, and she uses that in order to lay eggs. And you already know the mosquito benefits, the organism, in this case being the human, is harmed, and the harm comes from the fact that they're having their blood consumed by the mosquito, and there's also potential for bloodborne pathogens like malaria, that don't harm the mosquito, but it harms a human, which ends up being a host to another parasite, which is the malaria. So that's the best way that I can explain these interactions. These This is going to be the vocabulary for the lesson for today, and we're going to be continuing this over the worksheet that we're going to start right after we're done going over the rest of the slides.